What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. This is the vlog for Friday, the 5th of November, 2021, and got a couple of things to talk about today. Nothing too crazy, or I guess maybe all that interesting, but a few things anyway. I want to start off, I want to talk about the Nikon Z9 again, or at least my reaction to my reaction of the Nikon Z9. I also am going to be talking about a little bit about the Canon R3. The manual has been published, and maybe I should start there because it's be the shortest of these. And then the last thing I want to talk about, kind of a rolling off of the Nikon Z9, is to talk a little bit about what I think Canon should do in the short term. Because the long term, I think Canon's pretty well, not going to have a huge amount of problems. Obviously, the R1 is coming sometime, in the next year probably, and is probably going to be, comparable or better than the Z9 in basically all respects. It's a generational thing. So let's start with talking real quick about the EOS R3 Manual. It's been published. A couple of things with respect to the R3 based on what I've seen in the manual. So first off, it looks to me like Canon may have fired whoever they had writing their manuals before. I've said this repeatedly in my R5 tips video that the manual for the R5 is probably one of the worst manuals that I have seen from Canon, camera related. Just there's typos, there's the least informative description text for things, paragraph information, the like. You go into something that is broadly brand new to photographers or photographers using the system. Things like HDR-PQ didn't exist on Canon cameras prior to the R5, the R6. I think the 1DX Mark III does it. But this new current generation of cameras, what does it do? How does it work? Why should I use it? They don't really explain any of that in the manual. And I've criticized basically anybody and everybody who writes camera or writes manuals or documentation for anything. If your documentation says, check the XYZ checkbox to enable XYZ, you're not writing documentation. You're not helping anybody. There's huge swaths, unfortunately, in Canon's R5 manual, all over the place. And it's not just limited to Canon, because as bad as the R5 manual is, the manuals from other companies are generally as bad or even worse. And this is not just in the camera industry, but across the board in all industries. That if your idea of what help is in a manual is to tell people the most basic thing that they ought to already have figured out, push the shutter release to take a picture, you're not writing a useful manual. The manual has to, yes, it has to cover the basic things. I'm not saying that can't be in there, but the manual also has to cover the whys and hows of the more complex things so that users can make informed decisions when they're using your product in the field to do things. I mean, a perfect example, we have an LG washing machine. We were trying to figure out what stain care does, and in the manual for the washing machine, it just says, turn on stain care to use stain care mode, and when it's it won't be enabled or it's disabled or whatever if you have cold wash turned on. And it's that's not helpful. What would be helpful would be to tell me what it does. So I can say, do I need to use stain care for this load or this, situation or not? And in fact, we kind of found out what it does in this sort of technical way by Googling and finding what LG Canada wrote about it, which is why that wasn't LG US, who knows? Why that wasn't in the manual, I don't get. But anyway, in reading through the manual cursorily, I haven't taken it apart completely yet. it's much better written in many places where I had a lot of issues with the manual, the R5, the R3 manual is better. So if you were an R5 or an R6 owner, not that it's going to help you tremendously, but you might want to download the R3 manual and read through what it says about some of the functions that you have questions about in your camera. Obviously, it's not the same camera, but the software is close enough that if something exists on both cameras, that you can largely expect that they're going to work the same way. And at least this is the theory I'm running on. And you get an actual explanation in a lot of cases in the R3 manual that you just weren't getting in the R5 or R6 manual. So the second thing that I noticed in the manual when looking at the R5 or the R3 is that apparently Canon... So I don't get what goes on with Canon software development. There's this weird... I just don't get it. I don't understand what Canon's doing. I don't understand Canon's thought process. Like, my thought process as a software person who went to school for computer engineering is you want to have one code base that you're working from, and you want to have everything roll along as in this code base. It's to the extent that you possibly can. And it's very clear to me that Canon has done that in places. There are certain things, you can see this even in the R5. There are certain things and certain features in the R5 that you can trace it all the way back to Canon's first DSLRs more than 10 years ago. And in some cases, the function doesn't even really make sense anymore. It's there, but what's the purpose of this thing that the way we use cameras has changed to the point that it's rendering some of these things, I won't say obsolescent, not obsolete yet, but obsolescent. There's other places in the EOS R series, including the R3, where I find myself going, why did this step backwards happen? One example is the metering exposure compensation range on the R3, R5, R6, RP, whatever. They're all limited to plus or minus 3 stops. On my 5D Mark IV, I can go plus or minus 5 stops. Now, I'm not going to say whether I'm got a video in the works right now about the metering system on the R5. I'm not going to say whether this is right or wrong. It very well may be, and it's certainly been my experience with at least the 5D Mark IV. I've never needed the plus or minus 5. I've only ever gotten out to 3. And the metering on the R3 seems to be even better and more accurate and more capable of getting me the picture I want with even less having to push to the extremes of exposure compensation. At least I haven't run into a scenario yet where I've had to. So that plus or minus 3 stops may be perfectly reasonable. But why change it? It was in the code base already. It had to be changed back. And it's just numbers. It's just let X equal the maximum or define the maximum step range as 3 stops or 5 stops. There's other places where things that existed in the EOS 1 code base really needed to exist in the R5, R6, and R3. And the thing I'm primarily thinking of is the ability to set limits on frame rates. So one of the things that when the R3 manual was announced that was available, one of the first things that I went to look at was to see if you could limit the drive mode or the frame rates in the drive modes, because sometimes you don't need 30 frames a second. All 30 frames a second's doing is generating a dozen frames that you don't actually need. And so I looked at what the frame rates are. So we know that the camera will do 30 frames a second in continuous high plus with a fully electronic shutter. That's the big number that Canon is advertising. The actual frame rates the camera does are as follows. So in continuous high plus, the electronic shutter does 30 frames a second. The electronic first curtain shutter gives you 15 frames a second, and the mechanical shutter gives you, I have 3 frames a second. I don't think that's right. I think I wrote something down there wrong. Hold that thought. Okay, yes, I did write something down there wrong. So in continuous high plus, the electronic shutter gives you 30 frames per second. The first electronic first curtain shutter gives you 12 frames a second, and the mechanical shutter gives you 12 frames a second. That's correct, okay? In continuous high, the electronic shutter drops you to 15 frames a second. The electronic first curtain shutter gives you 8 frames a second, and the mechanical shutter gives you 6 frames a second. And in continuous low, you get 3 frames a second regardless of the shutter mode. So that is better than the R5, because the R5 is 20 frames a second in continuous whatever, doesn't matter if the electronic shutter is active. You get 20 frames a second even in continuous low. Given the option of having no control over the thing, or this kind of control over the thing, I'd rather have this kind of control over the shutter speed or the drive mode. However, when push comes to shove, I'd really like to see the EOS 1 style ability to limit the maximum frame rate manually for each of the drive modes. It just seems like the most reasonable sort of solution that's possible. Okay, so that's what I've got to say about the R3 now that we have the manual available. I want to move on to talking about the Z9 again, or rather my reaction to the Z9 again. So the funny thing is somebody smarter than me said a while ago, I don't even remember where I read this, but that whenever a new camera is released, the initial release is, upon the initial release, if it looks like it's really impressive, it always, by the time it gets released, doesn't seem as impressive as it did at release. And if it looks like it's underwhelming or has an issue, the issue turns out to be not as big of a deal as the paper-pushing pundits make it seem on release. A perfect example is the R5's overheating problem. Yes, it overheats, but it turns out that by and large, I'm not seeing the kind of actual problems that is causing versus the sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth that was the case before people had the camera in hand and were actually shooting with it. And, it makes sense to a certain extent because, when you're just looking at specs, and especially when you're just looking at the marketing, and this is always the challenge with looking at the marketing, but when you're just looking at specs or the marketing, you're seeing the rose-colored picture that's painted by the camera company. It's what they want you to see. And of course, any of us, it doesn't matter what brand you shoot, it doesn't matter what level you shoot at, none of us want to look at a $1,000, $2,000, $4,000 camera and go, well, it's not perfect. It's a lot of money. I want perfect. You know what I mean? It's hard to not, when there are faults, and there's always going to be faults, but when there are faults, it's hard not to really not want those to be there, especially when you don't understand the actual nuance of the fault. So what Peter McKinnon found with the R5 overheating when he's shooting like constantly at 120 frames per second versus what somebody else or what I found, how it actually impacts me when I only use 120 frames per second incredibly sparingly and in not outside and not in the bright sun or not in these conditions. There's different considerations, there's different factors. So that's something that always tempers the discussion. So when I saw the Z9 last week, I was really impressed with the camera. There's only been twice in the entire time that I've been doing photography where I have seriously thought about changing from Canon to Nikon. Once was back when the D800 or D700 came out, and the D700 looked like it was just a phenomenal camera for, what I was doing at the time and what I wanted. And the Z9 almost got to that level. And I say almost got to that level because back when the D700 was new, I actually went all the way through the motions of looking at changing systems. So I figured out, like, I got ideas on what I could sell my Canon gear for. I got an idea of what it would cost me to upgrade or buy Nikon equivalents. Now, the problem at the time is that when I was looking at the D700 is that there weren't equivalents for certain things. There were somewhat equivalents. There were paper equivalents. For example, Nikon still have it, the 80 to 400, and I had a 100 to 400, but optically the 80 to 400 was an inferior lens. It still is compared to the 100 to 400 Mark II, and as far as I can see, the 100 to 500 RF. So just swapping out 100 to 400 for 80 to 400 would be going backwards, taking a hit in image quality. I didn't want to do that. So there were places with going to Nikon when I was looking previously where I would have had to upgrade to a lot more expensive lenses, a 200 to 400 instead of an 80 to 400 and whatnot. And broadly, that killed it for me that time, back in about 2009, somewhere in there, that the costs just outweighed the benefits by a massive margin. And the reality was, and I think this was a good learning lesson for me, because the reality is that better cameras from Canon came. I just had to be patient. And it wasn't like I couldn't take pictures, and it wasn't like I couldn't take good pictures, and it wasn't like I, was just totally frustrated and flustered and incapable of doing anything camera related. I just didn't have as good of a camera as I felt a Nikon user would have had or had. That's really not the case with the Z9. In fact, it's really hard for me to say that that's the case with anything at this point, because the simple reality is that all of the brands, Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, have really good cameras now. And there is no, when I survey the field, there is no broadly available camera or broadly out there camera that has such a massive lead in terms of some kind of performance and capability that renders any other potential problems a moot point. Like, I'd rather deal with bad ergonomics or bad user interface or whatnot, because this camera is so much better. So yeah, the Z9 looks like a really solid camera. It's arguably better in some respects than the R3, but then in other respects, the R3 is probably a better camera for some users than the Z9 is. For me, the Z9 aligns more with my usage patterns than the R3 does, but so does the R5, which is what I'm shooting with. So I've already got an R5. It already works really well for me. And the things the Z9 offers over the R5, and this is sort of the realization that I came to, just isn't compelling as an argument to switch. So 20 frames a second. My camera already does that. Now, but people will point out, well, but the Z9 does 30 frames a second. Marketing. Digging through what, information that's come out post-announcement of the Z9, it's 20 frames a second for RAW, it's 30 frames a second in JPEG. Well, I don't shoot JPEG. Couldn't care less there. So there goes my 30 frames a second. 120 frames a second at 11 megapixels. Well, again, I don't need 120 frames a second stills, and 11 megapixels is really not sufficient for me to really consider, what am I trying to say? 11 megapixels is really not sufficient for me to consider shooting in that mode ever. as the kind of photography that I do. So the Z9 essentially matches my R5 in terms of resolution at RAW and frame rate. Now, is its readout faster? Sure. Is it going to matter? Maybe. I don't know. But that's not a big enough compelling factor for me to consider selling all my Canon gear and switching to a Nikon Z9. The bigger problem for me, though, tends to come down to ergonomics and user interface and basically those kinds of things. Because the technology really isn't... The technology, as much as there are things that I look at the technology on the Z9 and I say, that would be cool to have, or boy, I'd like to have that, or that would be neat, that's awesome, good job. The reality is that I can live without them. I'm not so beholden to needing a 100% true non-blackout viewfinder that doesn't ever actually pause or display the image twice or something like that, that I need to switch platforms. So, ergonomics. Let me just talk about this real quick, because there's a broader point here about, and I've been saying this for years for people who look at cameras. You got to buy the camera that works for you, not the camera that's technologically impressive. Because at this point, like I said, the technologically impressive part really isn't going to make a whole lot of difference. So I've used Nikon cameras in the past, not like for years or months, but for days at a time. And regarding Nikon's ergonomics, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it ends up usually bothering my wrist. Now, when I was young, I broke my right wrist. That, I'm not impaired in any significant way. It healed. It's fine. It doesn't bother me on a daily basis or whatever. I don't know if it's actually contributory or not, but this is the wrist you hold the camera with. And for me, whatever it is about the way I hold Nikon cameras versus the way I hold Canon cameras, and it's a distinct, there is a difference, I can tell, largely because I need to be able to get to the aperture dial that's on the front of the camera as opposed to having everything on the top of the camera. After a day of shooting, my wrist usually bothers me. It's not, oh my God, I got to put it in a brace or something like that. It's just not happy. Not invisible, as most of your joints normally are. You just don't know that they're there. They just move. So that's always been a struggle with me for Nikon. Now, could I adapt to that? Could I get around that? Well, sure, but it goes back to my broader point. How much better is the technology that I'm getting for having to adapt to it, or for having the discomfort from using it? The same thing goes for user interfaces. That I don't want to fight with my camera. I'm over fighting with cameras. That we really, again, reiterating that point over and over and over again, there is so much parity in all of the disparity of camera technology. As much as everybody else waggles and wails about their specific little hypes up, their specific little function or feature, there is so much parity in the technology that, to me, fighting with the camera because you're getting a 0.5% better something doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I've never really thought the way Nikon UIs work. And so this is a personal thing. So if you're a Nikon user and you love Nikon cameras, good on you. Good for you. I'm not telling you to change. I'm not saying that your cameras are broken or wrong or something. There is an aspect of user interface design and user interfaces that is objective. You can objectively say whether a control is more easily accessible than another control based on human biomechanics and neuromuscular feedback and so forth. So you have certain things you can say objectively. There are other things that you really can't say objectively. And now people will try to say this, that they have an objective that measure that this is better. mostly because they can't disassociate their subjective opinions from objective realities, and therefore they think everything that they have as an opinion is an objective truth. But things like which direction a dial should turn to increment a value. You can make all kinds of arguments for right-hand rule, left-hand rule, this thought, that thought, the next thought. But the reality is, at least in a disconnected thing like a camera, you have a mental model of which direction the dial should turn to increment a value or decrement a value. You have a mental model of what incrementing and decrementing means. Is incrementing the shutter speed making it faster, so you have a smaller number or a shorter integration time? Or is incrementing the shutter speed making it slower, so that you have a bigger number or a longer shutter or integration time? You can make arguments either way. You could make an argument that, whichever way you want, but I'm not going to be like, you're not going to make an objective argument as to which one is the way everyone is going to or should think. So what does this have to do with the Nikon? Well, what it has to do with is that their dials, their lenses, their controls, they rotate differently from Canon's. Canon's happen to map directly to the way I think. People will say, oh, that's just because you use Canon cameras. If you use Nikon cameras, you'd start to think that. Well, that's true. If I used Nikon cameras, I would get used to it, and I would be able to compensate for it. But what I'm talking about when I say map directly to the way I think is when I picked up my first Canon camera with no real previous exposure to understanding or thinking or doing anything with a camera, the dials turned the direction I thought they were supposed to turn. I didn't spend any time turning the thing the other, like going, oh, I meant it to the other way. It picked it up and it naturally just turned in the direction that I expected it to. People would say, well, that's intuitive. No, what I'd say is my mental model lined up with Canon's model. Physical reality, whatever you want to call it. With a Nikon camera, it doesn't work that way for me. Nothing turns the way I expect it to. Now, with the mirrorless cameras, you can remap dial rotation directions and focus ring rotation directions, and so there's a ability to compensate in a without me having to relearn. I can have the camera help me relearn, but there are things like the zoom ring direction that you can't remap, and as little as that sounds like it should be an issue, for me, it's an issue because, again, goes back to what I was saying about there isn't such a technological advantage for me to really want to put up with that kind of frustration. Temporary, permanent, short-term, long-term, whatever, it doesn't matter. Which brings me to kind of the last point that I had when I was thinking about the Z9 sort of over the last week, which is I can wait. In fact, I think the vast majority of photographers who are out there, if you're a Canon user or a Sony user, and you look at the Z9 and you go, wow, that's amazing, I really like that. Well, everything that the Z9 has feature functionality-wise is going to show up in a Canon camera, probably the R1, Sony A1 Mark II. I mean, it's going to be there. You can wait. Unless you're a, top 1% professional photographer who's absolutely, hammering at their work and they need the tiniest little advantages to get the shots because they're just not getting it with whatever. You don't need to, you can wait. You can wait for it to show up in your platform. And I look at, for example, thanks largely to the pandemic, I haven't even gotten a chance to take my R5 out in the field and use it seriously. I mean, I've used it, but the travel photography, wildlife photography that I was doing prior to the pandemic, I haven't been able to travel for the last 2 years. It's just not been something that I've been able to do. And I've had the camera for almost a year now. So it's been used. I've gotten a good handle for it. I'm pretty sure I know what it can do, but I haven't actually put it out and done something with that in practice. I don't really need to replace it, So that said, there was one thing that I didn't talk about quick with the Nikon Z9 that I really wanted to talk about with the Nikon Z9, and that was, I think, Nikon's pricing. It really struck me that I think Nikon really screwed up their pricing. Now, I hate to say that as a consumer, and I hate to say that as a photographer, because when I say Nikon screwed up their pricing, what I'm saying is they're not charging enough for the camera. They priced it at, I think it was $5,500, $5,000, $5,500, something like that. And it's not a $5,500 camera. It's a $7,000 camera. I'm sorry. It just is. That it's I would argue the Z9 is worth more, has better value, more valuable than the R3. And the R3 Canon's asking $6,000 for. Now, here's my problem with the thinking here. If Nikon wanted to sell the camera at $5,500, well, right now we have a shortage on electronics. It's impacting all kinds of industries. GPUs for computers are through the roof. $150 cards are going for like $700, $800 from scalpers on Amazon and eBay and whatnot. The car prices are going up because of the lack of electronics and the problems with the shortfall of electronics. Nikon's going to be able to sell every Z9 they can make. I'm pretty confident in that. They're probably not going to be able to make as many as they think they're going to be able to make, or as they'd like to be able to make, thanks largely to the shortfall of the shortages of electronics, which means that they're selling, as far as I'm concerned, they're selling the camera at a price that's designed to make it sell, which obviously is a good thing. Market share is good. The reality, though, is that the Z9 was never going to put Nikon in the lead market share-wise. They sell far more Z6 IIs than they'll ever sell Z9s. Sony sells far more A7s than they ever sell A1s. Canon sells far more R6s than they ever sell R3s. The thing that would put Nikon back in the running, so to speak, market share-wise, is a Z6 II or Z6 III that's major step forward, technology comparable, etc., etc. That's where the vast majority of the sales go. On high-end cameras, like I said, I hate saying this because it's not very friendly for the consumer, but milk them. Because you can always lower the price. It's not like, if Nikon was happy selling the camera for $5,500, they could have released the camera at $7,000 and sold every camera they made because, again, shortages, I don't think they're going to be making that many cameras, and the professional sports photographers and so forth will pay the $7,000. There's a whole slew of Nikon people that will pay $7,000 for a Z9, including a lot of rich people that just want the best camera that they can buy. In 3 months or 6 months, they can drop the price. It's easy to drop the price. Now, you can make arguments about people being upset because they bought a camera at $7,000 and then it went to $6,500, and then like 9 months later it went to $6,000, and then whatever, it went to $5,500. And I understand that because I don't want to buy something and then have the price fall out the floor on me. But then I bought my first EOS 5D Mark IV at $3,500, and I bought my second at less than $3,000 because the price dropped. I think it was less than $3,000. Whatever. But the price dropped, and it's sort of I think people can understand prices being lowered over time as the things go on. Certainly, if you're artificially inflating the price to help deal with the supply and demand issue. Then again, as supply becomes more available, you can potentially lower the price to increase the demand and generate more sales. The point here, though, is Nikon can't realistically push the Z9 up to $6 grand or $6,500 without pissing off a lot of people. Canon can realistically drop the price on the R3 in a couple of months to $5,500 or $5 grand and not piss off a lot of people. And the people that it would potentially piss off already paid and bought a camera. So they already got their money. And again, I hate saying this because it really is not, it's not very pro-consumer. But from a business perspective, I feel like they really should have pushed the camera out, higher price. They're confident in the technology. I mean, I guess the flip side is maybe they're just not confident in the performance of the camera. Like, you know, if you're confident, if I was Nikon, and again, I'm only working with the information we have. If I was Nikon and I'm looking at the camera and I'm looking at Sony and I'm looking at Canon and I'm going, this is better than what Canon's talking about with the R3, and this is better than what Sony's put out with the A1. We're going to price this as a flagship camera. We're going to price this like it's meant to be. Not we're going to price this on as to undercut the competition and try to make everybody think that we're, you know, giving you a really good value, because yes, it's a really good value at the price point it is. It's not a great business move for Nikon at the price point it is. And what does that say longer term? I think is where my thought is Nikon's been struggling financially. They made some bad plays a couple of years ago. They had to write off a huge amount of money. They had to lay off a huge amount of workers. The pandemic hasn't been great for them. I mean, it hasn't been great for anybody really, that, you know, at least in their sector. But the optimizing profit really seems to me like it would be the kind of thing to do. So that brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about is sort of what can Canon do? Where would I like to see? What would I like to see Canon do? So obviously we know the R1's coming. The R3 was never a flagship camera. It was never. The R3 was never a flagship camera. It was never intended to be the flagship camera. It says it right there in the name. It's not the R1. And 1 has always been Canon's flagship camera, and I don't see any reason that they would change that. So that said, in the meantime, you know, Canon has cameras. The R5 and R6 are certainly not going to be replaced next year or probably the following year, so they got a couple of years to go. The R3 is the R3. The R1's probably coming next year. But I think there's things Canon can do to help us and to make everything relevant, or continue to make things relevant, continue to make cameras that are maybe not the newest, hottest, flagshipiest things, continue to be relevant on the market, or more relevant on the market. And to that extent, the first thing I would say is Canon really needs to remove the stupid 30-minute record timer. We've talked about this. It's a constant complaint. It's a bit of software. There is nothing else that reasonably makes any sense other than it's a simple artificial limitation in the software. They could easily go through the firmware for every one of their current cameras, remove that line of code, and release a firmware update that would take out the 30-minute record limit on the 90D, the current Rebels, I don't even know what those are anymore, the 5D Mark IV, the 1DX Mark III, the R, the R6, the R5, the R3 is already not limited in that respect. The RP, you know, just get rid of it. The competition's already done that. Now, is it such a big deal? Again, I go back to, is it such a big deal that I'd change brands over it? No. I'd buy a recorder. I'd do what I do with these vlogs and plug the camera into the computer and record the HDMI output. It's not as sophisticated, it's not as friendly, it's not as elegant, but other than a vlog, I find that doing a bit to camera, I don't hit the 30-minute limit that often. I can work around it, even though it's frustrating and I'd like it gone. The second thing that I think Canon should be doing is moving to a common autofocus detection core algorithm thing. So I don't like the automobile manufacturer upgrade thought process. Oh, you want a new infotainment system? You want new maps for your infotainment system? Buy a new car. Like, to me, that's not a good way to do it. The cameras at this point should be working largely on the smartphone model, which is you get new features when new features are available, and they roll out largely across the product line. So your 3-year-old Apple iPhone has the same OS that the current fastest, newest phone does. Now, yes, you can't do some of the things that the iPhone 13 Pro XL Max 27-inch whatever phone can do because the hardware doesn't support it. And that's something that's entirely reasonable. But there's also a lot of stuff in these cameras that's pretty much software-based that pretty much could be done in the camera because pretty much the camera using the same software or same hardware is doing that kind of thing. So Motorsports AF, roll it out to the 6D and the R6 and the R5. I can understand, well, I can't even understand to a certain extent, like, well, it's going to stay in the R3 for a while to protect the sales of that market, and then we might roll it out. Like, there should just be a common autofocus core. If you're shooting with a 1D Mark III, you should be or 1DX Mark III, you should be getting this update for your live view autofocus tracking because it's got the same processor. It should be able to do the same kind of tracking. More software-related features. So I've banged on about how much I want cameras to implement synthetic neutral density. And even a ad hoc implementation that uses the existing averaging feature that's available in the camera, but extends it to 32 or 64 frames. Like, there is enough buffer in an R5 to shoot 64 frames of raw images, average them together, and save it to the file. 64 frames would give you 16's 4, 32, 6 stops of synthetic neutral density effectively that you could use, would be useful, even if you aren't going to or can't implement a full synthetic neutral density compressing live or averaging in real time with the sensor output system. Things like that. Better improve the HDR capabilities, improve the focus stacking capabilities. You know, Canon used to have a feature back when I had a 1D Mark III called depth of field priority, where you focused the camera on the subject, the closest thing you wanted in focus, you focused it on the furthest thing you wanted in focus. The camera noted where the autofocus distances were. It calculated the aperture that it needed to stop down to get all of that in focus, and then focused between the two of them in such a place that both things would fall in depth of field. That's gone. That would be tremendously useful with the focus stacking, to be able to focus on the near thing, focus on the far thing, and then let the camera figure out how many frames it actually needed to shoot instead of you having to guess and calculate. Honestly, and this has less to do with software features in the camera, but I've talked about too before, I would really like to see a USB-C follow focus that you could plug into the R5 or R6 or R3 and control with absolute stops and control RF lenses like they were cinema lenses. The camera should be able to do it. As far as I can tell, the autofocus commands, systems, etc., should have the ability to absolutely position and focus the lens. You should just, it just requires the ability to have an external thing that talks to the camera over, for example, the USB-C port. Likewise, I've talked about this before, I would really like to see a servo for cinema lenses that I could plug into the USB-C port, and with a little configuration on the camera, I don't mind doing that, drive those as if they were AF lenses. Because it would be really nice to be able to shoot this kind of content with a 35T 1.5 cinema lens instead of a DSLR lens, because I move around just enough that I'm not comfortable shooting at very fast apertures with a lens that can't focus on me. That I don't have a focus puller for shooting these vlogs or for anything I shoot. I rely on the autofocus to do that, and that means having some level of autofocus necessary on the lens. So a servo that could drive that from the USB port would be awesome. On that note too, and this is another perfect example, easy example, cinema cameras, the C500, C300, those cameras, they have a slightly different focus pulling algorithm for the autofocus when they drive autofocus lenses that still cameras don't have. They won't hunt, where the DSLRs and mirrorless cameras will. So if I was shooting with a cinema camera and you had a background worth looking at behind me that like had detail, and I walked out of frame, the camera would track that I left the frame, know that a face left the frame, and it would stay exactly where it was until it detected a face that it could focus on coming back into about where it was in the frame. On a mirrorless or a DSLR, the camera will try to focus to infinity. It'll try and focus on the background. It'll do all kinds of crazy things because there's nothing, and it's using basically the still camera autofocus algorithm, which is try to find something to focus on as opposed to leaving the camera where it was. They already got the software. It's already in the Cinema EOS firmware. Why not bring it over to the mirrorless? Why not bring it to the R5, the R6, the R, the R3, etc.? So anyway, I'm going to wrap this ramble up there. I think I've rambled enough. If you happen to find this interesting or at least a little bit entertaining, please let me know by smashing that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe if you haven't subscribed now. And if this seems like it might be something that would interest somebody you know, please consider sharing it with them. It helps grow the channel, and that's something I definitely would like to do. So, with all that said, as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.